All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about feudalism. This is just a review for those of you that want to hear the lecture twice. So we talked about feudalism when we were in Japan, and we're going to talk about it again here in Europe. So feudalism is our political system, and the economic system that goes along with that is called manorialism. Medieval social roles. You had your king and your queen at the top. You had your nobility afterwards, which is made up of lords. And there were rankings of lords. If you had more land and more power, you were a higher up lord. And if you had less land and less power, you were a less powerful lord. The clergy would be the church. So that could be the pope at the top, the bishops, and then the local priest in each town. Those would be the clergy members. And then the peasants, that's going to be the majority of society. And they have the least amount of rights that exist in society. So here's feudalism for you. It's pretty similar to Japan, except in Japan, remember, we had that shogun at the top who was really ruling the country for the emperor. We don't have that here. The king is the person in charge, followed by the lords, the knights, and the peasants. Now, the king is not an absolute ruler. Now, an absolute ruler means you have all of the power. No one can tell you what to do. But the king in the society, he didn't really have all the power because the lords kind of ran their own show in their little village. So yes, the king was the top dog, but the lords could compete with him. If they were mad at the king, several lords could get together and rebel against him. So the king was not an absolute ruler, which is different than in a lot of times in history, because most of the times when we see a king, he is the absolute ruler. So feudalism developed as a result of frequent invasions, specifically from the Vikings, which are going to be in Scandinavia, and we'll talk about them later this chapter. Here you can see on the screen, we have invasions coming from all around, coming from the Mongols, coming from the Vikings, coming from the Magyars. And due to this, people needed protection. And the large-scale kingdoms weren't protecting the people. They needed a castle to go to protect themselves. So that's why feudalism was so successful. So as we've talked about, if you're the king, you would divide your land up, and you would give that land to somebody else. That person would have to pledge loyalty to you. The fief of land is what you would get if you were a lord, and on that fief there would already be people living there, and the peasants kind of just went with the land. They were just kind of tied to that land, so if the lord changed, then they had a new lord. They didn't get to move. They didn't have any rights. So the fief is the physical piece of land. The vassal is the person that gets the land. So fief, land, vassal, person. Got it? All right. Try to answer this in your notes. Pause the video if you need to. So knights are our warriors. They're similar to the samurai. They're going to often wear heavy armor. They have horses that they would ride, and they have a code, just like the samurai have a code, which I think it's so cool that these two societies on halfway around the world from each other and had no contact developed such similar social systems. So the knights had to follow chivalry. And that was about honesty, fairness, loyalty, and there was also this piece about treating women properly, which is interesting because when we use the word chivalry in modern times, that's what it means. It means like, opening the doors and having good manners. That's chivalry. So, knight's obligation to the lord. They had to provide military service, remain loyal, give money. The lord's obligation to the knight, they had to give them land. Now, the knight might get a tiny piece of land. It wouldn't be like a huge fief like the lord had. They had to try to avoid conflict, so not make their lord fight battles when it was unnecessary, and resolve disputes between the knights. All right, so now you can see our social system. If you want to pause your notes here to get this down in your book. All right, so king is at the top with our powerful nobles underneath, lesser nobles, and knights could be part of that lesser nobility. And at the bottom, there are serfs and freemen. And we'll get into the difference between serfs and freemen here in a second. And so you can see as you go up the pyramid, you need to give loyalty to the person ranked above you. And the people ranked below you, you're supposed to give land and protection to them. So this is a lot of information, but we'll get through it. So serfs. Serfs are bound to the land. So if the lord changes, it doesn't matter to them. They have to still be on that land. Serf was a hereditary status. So if you were a serf, your children would be a serf. They are the peasants, sorry if I didn't say that. They basically had a really terrible life. They would farm on the land for the lord. They might get a small piece of land to farm for themselves, and maybe they could sell that excess, but likely that was what they needed to feed their family. They would get protection from the lord, and that was kind of what they got in return. So if there was an invasion, they would go to the lord's castle, and that was kind of what they got in return, which just doesn't sound that great. But kind of the light in the life of the serfs was the church. So they were all very dedicated to the Catholic Church. And the reason they were so dedicated to the Catholic Church was because that concept of eternal life in heaven was so great to them, because their life here on earth had been so terrible. So similar to how like Buddhism really took root in China because of the Warring States period and people wanted escape from suffering, this concept of eternal life in heaven was the serf's way of escaping suffering. So if you need to pause your notes here, go ahead and do that. All right, so again, during medieval times, there were kings, but they were not absolute rulers.
Anyone here who is in choir, we have early morning rehearsal in the auditorium at this time.
So you can see here that the main kingdoms were the Anglo-Saxons. This is modern day England. We have our Frankish Empire, which takes up modern day France, Germany, and even a little bit of Italy. We have the Umayyad Caliphate, which if you'll remember, that was one of the Arab dynasties that we discussed in our Islam chapter. They still exist here in modern day Spain. And then we have our Byzantine Empire, which we've talked about. But the Byzantine Empire isn't really part of Europe, because we can see that's more in Turkey. That's technically in Asia. So the main groups we're going to be talking about are the Frankish Empire and the Anglo-Saxons. And so you can see that's a large piece of land. And so there is a king ruling that. However, the lords can just kind of the king doesn't affect their everyday life. They rule their piece of territory. And if the king calls upon them for service, they're supposed to give that service. But really, the lords rule their own little territory. All right, so answer this question in your notes. So what we just talked about was the political system. Now we're going to be talking about the economic system, which is manor. So a manor was the individual village, and they were self-sufficient. So a lord would have a manor. You can see here, here's a different picture of a manor. They didn't really need to trade because they created everything they needed in this manner. And that created a system where trade wasn't important. And if you don't have trade, you don't have cultural diffusion, which is another reason why Europe in the Middle Ages lacked a lot of cultural achievements, because they weren't trading with other people. So if you want to pause here, get a better look at the manor system. I don't know why I can't go to my next slide. All right, so here we go. Here's feudalism versus manorialism. Pause and take notes here if you need to. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope this was helpful. Have an awesome day.